Sell me the spring or bury your cattle. Those words would cost every man in that yard more than they ever bargained for, partner. Because nobody in Doña Ana County knew that the trail-worn drifter watering his horse at the far end of the trough was a hunted gunslinger with a federal price on his head. I was there that August morning, propped against a fence post at the edge of the Vasquez property when Crane's riders came down off the south ridge, and I watched the whole thing from beginning to end. Her name was Nora Vasquez, 26 years old, widowed the year before, running a cattle operation outside the town of Tierra Blanca, New Mexico territory. In the long drought summer of 1881, the spring on her land, cold limestone water that had never gone dry in 3 generations, was the only reliable water in 17 miles of alkali flat and parched creek bed. Holloway Crane had 7,000 head of cattle and no water left to give them, and the lean, quiet man at her water trough was about to change what refusing him would cost her. If you're riding along tonight, partner, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss one of these stories. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now, what time it is where you're sitting. We read every single one. Now pour yourself something warm, and let's go back to that summer. Let's go back to the spring. Nora's husband, Alejandro Vasquez, had found that spring on his family's land when he was 11 years old, followed a strip of deep green mesquite up a dry hillside on a September afternoon, digging with his bare hands when the ground went soft, until the cold water broke through and soaked his shirt, and he ran home with the news. 3 generations of that family understood something that took most men years of hard losing to learn. In drought country, the man who holds the water holds everything else. You could rebuild a fence line after a bad winter. You could work new pasture after a long dry. But water, true water, deep limestone water that laughed at August's worst heat, was not something a man replaced or manufactured or bought at a price that made sense for the seller. Alejandro built the whole operation around it. Stone trough, catch basin, a secondary gravity feed tank. He'd laid the pipe for himself in the summer of 1877. When fever took him in the spring of 1880, Nora inherited the 60 head, the decent barn, the house with real glass windows, and the spring. She also inherited every man in the county who suddenly developed strong opinions about what a widow needed and how they intended to provide it. Most she turned away with a pleasant firmness that left no opening. A few required something less pleasant. She was not a woman who had grown up in the New Mexico territory without learning the difference between a man offering help and a man who had already decided what she owed him. She had her husband's practicality and something else besides. A stubbornness that wasn't defensive, but was simply present the way the limestone was present under the valley floor, deep and indifferent to the weight of things piled on top of it. None of those men was Holloway Crane, which was lucky and unlucky at once. Lucky because Crane operated at a different level from a pushy neighbor or a presumptuous county clerk. Unlucky because by the time he turned his full attention on Nora and her spring, she had no particular experience with what that kind of attention looked like up close. Crane ran the Tierra Blanca Cattle and Land Syndicate from a stone office on the main street of town. He was 53 years old, heavy-set in the way of a man who'd been comfortable for a long time, with a close white beard and eyes the color of winter sky, pale gray and entirely without warmth. He'd come out from St. Louis in 1874 with borrowed capital and what you'd have to call a talent for acquisition, and in 7 years he'd built 12,000 acres, over 1,000 head of cattle, a partial interest in the freight line, and an arrangement with every county official that made his operations run with a smoothness that implied something deeper than ordinary competence. What people in Tierra Blanca understood about Crane, even those who did business with him and considered themselves on reasonable terms, was that his acquisitions operated by a particular logic. He didn't steal. Not exactly. He constructed situations in which selling or surrendering became the rational choice, which is a different thing and one considerably harder to prosecute. A neighboring rancher found himself unable to get credit at the only bank in town, and sold to Crane 6 weeks later at below market price. An irrigation ditch that two operations had shared for a decade was suddenly claimed as Crane's property through a survey that produced a boundary line nobody had ever disputed before. A man who had filed a complaint with the county commissioner's office received a visit 2 days later from Nestor, and two riders who sat their horses in his yard for an hour without saying anything in particular before riding away. The complaint was withdrawn the following morning. These things happened with a regularity that anyone paying attention could track, but the pattern was never quite explicit enough to take to a territorial judge and make stick. Nestor was worth a word on his own account, partner. Burl Nestor had the specific competence of a man who had spent 15 years making himself useful to men like Crane. He was not clever in the way that left marks on people. He was clever in the way that arranged for other things to do the marking. He knew which fence lines could be cut in the dark and which couldn't. He knew the county sheriff well enough that the man received a Christmas turkey every year from Crane's operation, and developed over time a reliable ability to be elsewhere when Crane's business required a certain kind of space. Nestor kept no records of his own and conducted nothing on paper. He was the kind of man who made a land syndicate's operations run clean, which is to say he carried the dirt so that the man in the stone office stayed unstained. The summer of 1881 was the second dry year running, and his cattle were ranging out 10 and 12 miles from the main water sources, losing weight, dying in small groups on the alkaline flats. 2 wells he'd sunk on the North Range in spring hit nothing but dry rock at 40 feet. His foreman Burl Nestor laid it out plain in June. They'd need to sell half the herd at a loss before September, unless another water source appeared. Crane was not a man who absorbed losses without a response. He came at Nora first through a lawyer named Stiles, who maintained an office above the hardware store, and whose actual function everyone in the county understood. $1,500 for the water rights, not the land itself, just the right to run Crane's cattle to the spring on a scheduled rotation. The document Stiles delivered included a clause allowing Crane to expand the access easement at his own discretion, which was where the arrangement revealed itself for what it was. Nora set the document back on the desk and walked out without discussion. A revised offer came in May. That one went back too. In June, Crane came himself, riding out with Stiles and 2 quiet men she hadn't seen before, men who sat their horses at the edge of her yard and watched the house windows while the lawyer made his presentation. Crane was courteous the way powerful men are courteous when they've already decided on an outcome and are simply managing the timing of it. He had words about the valley's need for cooperation, about the regrettable realities of a second dry year, about the fairness of what he was willing to pay. His pale eyes delivered a different message from his words, something that sat in the air of the yard after he rode away and took time to dissipate. She didn't sleep well that night. She didn't mention it because there was no one to tell. Her nearest neighbor, a decent man named Harlow, who'd run a small goat operation on the East Flat, had sold to Crane in March after his credit at the county bank mysteriously stopped working. The other ranchers in the valley had their own pressures. She was alone in the practical sense of the word, which is the sense that matters when trouble has your address. Crane's lawyer came once more in July, with a document containing the phrase, "Access rights defaulting to buyer in case of non-payment of outstanding lien." When Nora asked what lien, since there were no liens on the property, the man delivered an expression of regret so practiced it had worn smooth. She showed him out. That same week someone cut her north fence line in the dark, and 20 of her cattle pushed through onto the open flat. She spent 2 days in August heat working them back alone and found 3 dead from low cowweed on the open range. She repaired the fence. She kept her own counsel. She began sleeping with Alejandro's rifle beside the bed. And then it was the 3rd week of August, and Crane rode out on a Tuesday morning with Nestor, 4 hired men she didn't recognize, and a county assessor named Digby, who carried a leather satchel that clinked when he walked. They came to the spring where Nora was filling the catch tank in the early quiet. Crane pulled up at the edge of the yard and delivered the line he'd been building to since April. "Sell me the spring or bury your cattle." That was when the stranger at the far end of the trough looked up from watching his horse drink. He'd ridden in 20 minutes before Crane's party appeared on the south ridge, which turned out to be a matter of timing the territory would discuss for years afterward. He came in on a buckskin gelding that had seen better miles, a man of perhaps 35 with dark hair going gray early, and a 3-day beard and a quietness that sat on him like something worn in rather than performed. He gestured at the trough with the minimal courtesy of a man not accustomed to asking for much, and Nora had waved him forward without thinking much of it. When Crane put his ultimatum on the morning air, the stranger looked from Crane to the 4 hired men arranged behind him, to Digby with his satchel, to Nestor with his hand already drifting toward his belt. Then he looked at Nora at the spring basin. His voice carried across the yard without being raised. That's an unusual thing to say to a woman at her own water. Crane turned with the mildly annoyed expression of a man encountering an obstacle he hadn't accounted for. This is a private matter, friend. Hard to keep private at this range. Nestor's hand moved to the holster. The stranger's gun was already out and level. The shot caught Nestor's gun hand and sent the pistol spinning into the dirt 6 feet away, and Nestor bent over the saddle horn, clutching his fingers and making a sound through his teeth that wasn't quite a word. Nobody else moved. Nobody spoke. The birds had gone quiet in the cottonwoods. The morning was very still. The stranger's gun was back in its holster. He hadn't appeared to draw it. He just had, and now he didn't. He looked at Crane with the mild expression of a man who has made a practical point and is content to wait. Like I said, the lady doesn't look like she wants to sell. He took his horse by the reins and led it back from the trough. Then he looked at Nora. You mind if I camp in your barn tonight? My horse needs rest. Nora looked at the stranger, looked at Crane. Crane was watching the stranger with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not fear, exactly, the recalculation of a man whose arithmetic no longer worked. You can camp in the barn. She turned and walked back toward the house without waiting to see if he'd follow. Crane and his men left without another word. The sound of their horses on the hard summer ground thinned and faded south, and the yard was quiet again, and the spring ran cold and clear over its stone lip the way it had always run. She found out his name that evening at the kitchen table, Caleb Decker. She'd heard it somewhere before, and couldn't place where. That turned out to be telling. He sat across from her, going through the deed papers she'd brought out from the desk, his eyes moving over the original survey plat with an attention that didn't match what she'd expected from a drifter. Patient, systematic, the particular literacy of someone who'd worked with such documents for years. He found the boundary line along the limestone ridge to the north and held the plat to the lamp. Crane's going to argue the spring falls on the north side of that line. He traced a line with one finger. He'll pay for a new survey that agrees with him. Then the lean language in his documents becomes the mechanism for a forced transfer. The county court signs off, and the spring changes hands without anyone being able to point to the exact moment where the law was broken. Nora was quiet. She'd suspected something like this. Hearing it laid out precisely was different from suspicion. How do you know how he'd do it? I've seen men do it before. She looked at him across the lamp. The way he read the survey plat. The particular speed that had preceded and then dissolved Nestor's draw. You're not a drifter. Not a question. No, I'm not. Caleb Decker had ridden for the U.S. Marshal Service out of the Santa Fe office for 8 years, partner, before circumstances had pushed him sideways into his current position. His reputation in the territories was the quiet kind, built on things that actually happened rather than stories told in saloons. He was fast with a gun the way genuine speed always presents, without performance, without drama. The hand and the intention arriving together as one unbroken thing, as if the weapon were an extension of the decision rather than a tool in service of it. He had the patience of a man who'd spent years tracking people across country that would kill you by accident, and he could read a legal document and a piece of ground with equal care and equal precision. The service had suited him in ways that surprised people who expected a man of his particular talent to be restless in official work. He wasn't. He had a genuine belief in the law as a structure, not the perfect kind of belief that ignores what the law looks like when the wrong people are running it, but the practical kind that understands the structure is worth preserving even when specific instances of it are broken. He'd served under a marshal named Poe, who had the same quality, and the 8 years under Poe had been good years, the kind where a man wakes up understanding what he's doing and why, and goes to bed with the accounts roughly balanced. The trouble had come not from a failure of law, but from its deliberate misuse, which was a different category of problem and one that required a different response. Pharaoh had been a slender man with good manners and a bookkeeper's mind, the kind of man you could sit across from for an hour and not quite believe was capable of the thing he'd done. But the evidence was clear, the documentation was clean, and the harm was specific and traceable. Families who'd spent everything on homestead claims, a man who died the winter after losing his, 2 women widowed not by violence but by the particular variety of ruin that comes from legal machinery turned to crooked ends. Decker had been patient through every procedural step. He'd done it right. He'd brought the case forward through the proper channels, and then the proper channels had explained to him, with great courtesy and considerable regret, that this particular case was not one that was going to result in a conviction. He'd left the service 18 months earlier, when he arrested a man named Pharaoh, an intermediary who'd been selling federal land survey data to private speculators across 3 territories, letting them buy land cheap before public surveys and sell it back to settlers at 10 times the value. 2 families he knew of had lost their homestead claims when the legal challenges came through. One man had spent everything he had on a parcel that evaporated and died the following winter. Decker had ridden after Pharaoh against direct orders from his marshal, caught him, and brought him back across his saddle. Pharaoh had connections running into the territorial government. Within a week of the arrest, a polished man arrived in Decker's office and spoke patiently about the realities of territorial politics and how certain documents might need to go missing. Decker was constitutionally incapable of making evidence disappear. Pharaoh sat in federal custody in Albuquerque. Decker no longer drew a marshal's salary. A federal warrant existed for his arrest on a charge of misappropriating evidence, which was the official language for what had actually happened. $300 on his head, enough to be inconvenient, not enough to draw the serious hunters. He'd been working a loose circuit through the territory for 18 months, doing what needed doing without the authority to do it officially. He'd heard about Crane from a freight driver on the Mesilla Road who mentioned a land operator squeezing ranchers in the Tierra Blanca Valley. Heard the word widow. Something about the shape of it pulled at him. He'd pulled his horse left at the next fork and ridden 2 days south, not entirely sure why, except that it was the kind of situation he couldn't comfortably ride past. He told Nora most of this by the time the lamp burned down to half. She listened without interrupting, her hands flat on the table, her eyes steady. When he finished, she was quiet a moment. "You're a wanted man," she said, "establishing the ground, not judging it, technically. And you stepped into Crane's business today over a woman you'd never met. That's about the size of it." Something moved briefly in her expression. Not quite amusement, but close to it, and close to something else too. "What happens now?" she said. He thought about it straight. Crane would come back with more men. Whoever he sent next would know Decker's name. "We need to hold this place for 3 weeks minimum," he said. "I have a contact in the Santa Fe Marshal's office, a deputy named Colton. We worked together 4 years. He'll listen, and he has jurisdiction over what Crane has been doing, if we can get the evidence to him." She put her hands flat on the table, the gesture of a woman steadying herself against something. "Then we get started," she said. The next morning he was walking the property lines before dawn, rifle across his arm, building the picture you build of a place you know you're going to have to defend. He found the angle from the north ridge, where you could see the spring basin clearly while staying invisible from the main road. He found the dry creek draw along the east fence that let riders approach the house within 200 yards under cover. He found the old root cellar built into the hillside south of the barn, its door invisible in the brushy slope, unless you knew it was there. Nora came out mid-morning with water and cold biscuits, and sat on a fence rail while he ate. She'd been watching him work for a while, and there was an evaluation in how she watched. That wasn't suspicious exactly, just careful. The kind of looking a person does when they're revising their understanding of a situation. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know. If Crane's men come back and they recognize you, there's a bounty. $300 I've been worth more at other points." He looked at the valley. The spring was visible from here, the stone lip of the basin catching the morning light. When I was in the service, 8 years of it, I rode after men who took things from people who couldn't stop them. Land, cattle, water, sometimes worse. The law is a good tool when it works. When the man with the badge is the man doing the taking, you're left with whatever else is available. He looked at her directly. "I'm whatever else is available right now." She considered that. Then she stood and picked up the plate. "Come inside," she said. "There's something you need to see." What she showed him was Alejandro's private ledger. Not the ranch accounts at the desk, but the other one, kept in a tin box under the stone floor of the root cellar. 3 years of entries in her husband's precise hand. Every conversation where Crane's name surfaced, every neighbor who'd sold, and what they'd said about the pressure they'd been under. The dates of fence-cutting incidents on other ranchers' properties, the names of 2 men who'd worked for Crane and later quit and gone south. Decker read through it twice at the kitchen table. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted, the focused quality of a man who's been building something and has just found the piece that makes it fit together. Your husband was building a case. He believed the law catches up eventually, Nora said. He didn't live to see it. He might have built more of a case than he knew. Decker turned back through the entries, stopping on 2 names, the Harlow place and the Reyes grant east of town. Were either on original Spanish land grants? Reyes, yes. Grant from 1796. Harlow's father bought his land from the original grant holder in 1858. Decker set the ledger down. He was quiet for a moment, running the implications. Then there's a federal angle. Land grant fraud doesn't go to the county bench. It goes straight to the federal court in Santa Fe. Crane's county judge has no jurisdiction. They spent the next 4 days building the defenses, and the work had a quality to it he hadn't expected. Nora knew the property the way you can only know a place you've spent your whole life working, every fold and shadow and seasonal variation of it. She showed him a second catch basin behind the north barn wall, built specifically because she'd always worried about the main spring being interfered with. She showed him the angle from the root cellar door, how it gave a clear field over the entire yard, while keeping the shooter invisible from every approach. He ran wire across the dry creek draw at knee height on a horse, anchored to mesquite posts. It wouldn't stop a daylight rider, but in the dark it would announce them and slow the first horse long enough to matter. He showed her the trigger mechanism for a lamp oil flare he'd rigged at the east fence post. She studied it for a moment, then shortened the fuse by 2 inches. Better timing. He didn't comment on the improvement. He had her practice with the Winchester at moving targets across the yard, not for marksmanship, which she already had, but for the habits that keep you alive when what you're shooting at is moving fast and scared. Breathing slow, waiting for the right moment rather than the first available one. She learned the way people learn who already understand the principle and only need the words for the mechanics. In the afternoons, they worked side by side on whatever the operation required, regardless of everything else. Fence repairs, water system maintenance, the ordinary, unglamorous work of keeping a cattle property alive. The silence between them had settled into something that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind of quiet between people who understand the same situation and don't need the same words for it. One evening he was watching the sun go down over the north ridge, when Nora came out with 2 cups. They sat on the top rail in the long golden light, the cattle moving slow across the east flat, the spring catching the last of the color below them. The valley had the particular beauty of drought country at day's end, when the harsh white light softened and the parched land went warm and gold, and you could almost forget how much it needed rain. She asked about the arrest that had cost him the service. He told her about Pharaoh and the land surveys, and the men who'd lost homesteads. He was spare with it, not performing the weight but not pretending it was lighter than it was. He was the kind of man who'd been asked about the important things enough times to know the difference between explaining and describing. And what he did was describe. The families he'd found, the documents he'd read, the particular man who'd died the following winter, with nothing left to show for years of work toward a piece of land that had never actually been his to buy. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without redirecting it toward herself or the conversation into commentary. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. The light was leaving the ridge in shades of copper and then gray, and the first few stars were appearing in the east, and neither of them spoke for a time that was long enough to be comfortable. This was one of the things about her, Decker thought, that he hadn't expected, the quality of the quiet. Most people, when conversation paused, filled the space with something, opinion or question or the verbal equivalent of shifting weight from foot to foot. Nora let the quiet be what it was. "You knew when you brought him in that it would likely cost you the position," she said finally. "I knew it was possible. And you brought him in anyway." He looked at the last light leaving the ridge. "The men whose land Pharaoh took didn't get a choice about it. I had one." She was quiet. Then, "Alejandro would have liked you." He looked at her. She was watching the valley, not him, and there was nothing performed about it, just a plain statement that meant what it said, the kind of statement a careful person makes only when they're certain of it. "That's a considerable thing to say," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They stayed out there until the stars came in fully and the night air moved cool off the ridge, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Crane or Nestor or federal warrants. About the spring and what it had meant to 3 generations of Alejandro's family who'd known before anyone else in the valley what they had. About Decker's early years in the territory before the service, the provisional string of work, trail hand and freight guard and mine assayer, all of it temporary. All of it the motion of a man towards something he couldn't name yet until he found it. The kind of conversation that accumulates between people who are paying genuine attention to each other and have decided, without quite discussing it, that there's no particular reason to hurry. On the morning of the 6th day, Crane sent his next move. 7 men this time. Nestor was not among them, which told Decker something about how Nestor's hand was healing. The man riding point was someone he recognized from the silhouette alone, a stocky figure on a gray horse named Packard, who'd worked land operations in Texas, and who treated violence as a trade skill, and carried none of the vanity of flashier men. He was also considerably smarter than Nestor had been, and he came in already reading the property. Decker was in the barn when they came over the South Ridge. He'd been positioned there since before dawn, because he'd expected something today. Packard pulled up in the middle of the yard and laid out Crane's offer in a flat, businesslike voice. $50 for Decker to ride on. No questions, no warrants served. A fair price for the water rights. Everybody walks away. Decker came out of the barn into the morning sun, unhurried, hands at his sides, and stopped in the open yard. "Who told Crane my name?" "Digby. The assessor. He has contacts in the Santa Fe federal office." Packard looked at him steadily. "There's paper on you. $300. Digby's a land fraud accomplice who'll be explaining himself to a federal judge before long." Decker kept his voice pleasant. As for Crane's offer, no. Packard studied the barn door, the brush along the hill, the root cellar depression in the hillside. He was good enough to know he was missing something, and honest enough with himself not to pretend otherwise. "You're one man," he said. "That's been consistently the case," Decker agreed. It tends not to be the limiting factor people expect. Packard's right hand moved. The wire in the creek draw caught the two flanking riders at chest height as they tried to sweep around the barn, stopping their horses short and sending one man hard into his saddle horn. The clang of wire in the dark was exactly the announcement Decker had designed it to be. In the same moment, Decker was sideways into the barn doorway, already drawn, and the shot caught the web of Packard's right thumb. Not perfectly, because Packard was faster than Nestor and already moving, but it caught enough of the hand to spin his gun into the dirt, and Packard hauled his horse back on the left rein, cradling his right arm, hissing between his teeth. A rifle shot from the root cellar hillside, dirt erupting 15 feet in front of the nearest rider coming from the east. A second shot, closer. Then Nora's voice carrying across the yard, calm and without particular urgency, the voice of someone reporting conditions. I have 11 rounds and a clear angle on every one of you. The next shot is for the man on the bay horse, because he hasn't stopped reaching. Don't reach anymore. The man on the bay horse put his hand on his saddle horn. The yard went still. 7 men, 2 of them hurt, none of them in a position they'd chosen. The 2 in the draw were still untangling their horses. Decker walked out of the barn doorway. Packard, go back to Crane and tell him I wrote to Deputy Marshal Colton in Santa Fe 3 days ago. The letter names Crane and Digby in a federal land grant fraud scheme. It references the Reyes grant and the Harlow place, and the manufactured survey on this property and the courthouse arrangement Crane has been maintaining. It also references 3 years of documentation that Alejandro Vasquez kept before he died. He paused. That letter arrived in Santa Fe yesterday. If I'm alive and on this property when Colton responds, I'll direct him to every piece of evidence. If something happens to me, Nora Vasquez has a complete copy and will hand it to any federal officer who comes asking. He looked at Packard steadily. Tell your employer to think carefully about what version of this ends well for him. Packard held his eyes for a moment. Blood was running between his fingers. Colton knows you're wanted. Colton knows exactly who I am. He also knows my record. Go tell Crane. They went. 7 riders turned south, and the yard was quiet, and the hawk that had been working a thermal above the ridge came back to its slow circles. Nora came up from the root cellar and stood in the yard. She watched the departing dust for a moment. Was it true? She said. The letter. Every word. She looked at the ridge. What if he comes himself next time? Then, Decker said, I'll have a direct conversation with him. He turned toward the house. Come inside. I want to go through the ledger again before the light goes. 3 days later, Esperanza Reyes rode in alone. She was perhaps 60, white hair braided tight with the hands of a woman who'd worked land for 40 years. Her family had held their grant property since 1796. She'd sold to Crane in May, under what she described as the most sustained campaign of pressure she'd experienced in 6 decades of living in this territory. Her nephew worked as a clerk in the county assessor's office, an honest one, and he had seen the documents. What he'd seen was Digby preparing the Vasquez boundary survey materials under the letterhead of a land company based in Albuquerque. The same land company, traceable through 2 layers of legal organization, was owned by the same man who owned the Tierra Blanca cattle and land syndicate. Crane was having his own company survey his own manufactured dispute so that the title would appear to transfer to a disinterested party. The nephew had made copies at considerable personal risk. Decker read through them at the kitchen table that evening, and his silence had a different quality from his other silences. When he looked up, it was with the focused calm of a man who's found the last piece he needed. This makes it airtight, he said. He wrote 2 letters that night, one to Colton, longer than the first, with the fraudulent survey documents folded inside and a detailed timeline. One to a newspaper editor in Santa Fe he'd known for 4 years, a careful man who printed nothing he couldn't verify, and who had a particular appetite for stories where federal corruption met frontier fraud. He sent them north with a freight driver whose loyalties, by Nora's account, ran entirely to his own livelihood, and not to Holloway Crane. The 3 weeks had a rhythm to them that a single confrontation doesn't, partner. Mornings at the fence lines, afternoons at whatever maintenance the operation required, evenings at the kitchen table or on the porch steps in the cooling air. The conversation accumulated between them across those evenings, covering more ground than either of them would have predicted. She knew about his family in Missouri, farming people who'd watched him leave at 17 and received infrequent letters for 20 years since. She knew about the years before the service, the string of provisional work that amounted to a man in motion towards something he couldn't name, trail, hand, freight guard, mine assayer. All of it temporary, all of it. The restlessness of a person who hasn't yet found the shape of the thing that fits them. She knew the service had fit him, and that losing it had left a space he'd been riding around for 18 months without looking directly at. He knew about the spring and what it represented to 3 generations who'd understood its value before the drought made it obvious to everyone else. He knew her marriage had been a good one. The real kind where both people are genuinely better together than apart, and that the anger she'd carried after Alejandro died had not been at the fever, which was nobody's fault, but at the men who'd materialized so quickly afterward with opinions about what she needed. He knew she read survey plats as well as any trained assessor. He knew she had a patience that ran deeper than stubbornness, the patience of a person who has learned to distinguish between what can be changed and what needs to be outlasted. On the 12th day, Crane sent a process server with a county court injunction, temporary halt to use of the spring pending resolution of the boundary dispute, filed by the syndicate. The young man who delivered it was visibly uncomfortable about the assignment. He handed Nora the papers in the yard, apologized briefly, and rode away quickly. Decker read the documents. County court. Not federal. He set them down. This is actually useful. Documents the mechanism. He looked at her. Do you want to comply? She looked at the injunction for a moment. No. Then we don't. And Colton gets a copy of this in the next letter, with a note that the county court is being used as a component of the scheme. Crane's response to the non-compliance came on the 14th night. Not Packard again. 4 men with a practical purpose reached the spring, contaminate it with something that would render it unusable, and argue in the morning that the source had failed on its own. Decker heard them at the creek draw before they were halfway across the flat. The wire caught the first horse in the dark, and the sound it made rang out like a rifle shot in the stillness. 3 seconds later, the lamp oil flare went up at the east fence post, Nora's shortened fuse working exactly as she'd timed it, burning white and fierce, lighting the flat bright as noon for 40 seconds. 4 men completely exposed, 2 rifles on them from positions they couldn't locate. Decker's voice carried easily in the dark. Ride back the way you came. Tell whoever sent you that the spring is intact and this business is finished. They went. Afterward, Nora stood in the yard watching the last of the flare burn down on the fence post. The wire was yours, she said. The fuse was mine. It worked. Yes. She turned toward the house. Come inside. Coffee's on. She said it the same way she said everything, matter-of-factly, and he followed her in. Deputy Marshal Colton arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the first letter had gone north. He came with 2 deputies and a warrant. A compact man of perhaps 45, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd stopped finding this work dramatic and simply found it necessary. He looked at Decker in the yard and shook his hand. You look like a man who's been camping, Colton said. More or less. Your situation first, after, Colton said. Right now I need to understand what we have. Decker laid it out at the kitchen table. Alejandro's ledger, the fraudulent survey documents, the correspondence chain from Stiles through the various court filings, the complete timeline. Colton read with occasional questions, making notes in his own shorthand. When he finished, he sat back. This is clean, he said. Better than clean. The warrant named Holloway Crane and Thaddeus Digby as co-conspirators in federal land grant fraud. corruption of a public official, and conspiracy to defraud a property owner through manufactured legal instruments. It also named 2 county court officials. The county sheriff's office was subject to a separate inquiry, Colton mentioned, in the particular tone of someone who had already made up his mind about that matter. Crane was arrested the following morning at his stone office on the main street of Tierra Blanca. He emerged with his lawyer, which suggested he'd been expecting something, and he delivered a performance of outraged innocence that might have worked on a different audience. Colton read the warrant in a voice that made clear he'd heard that performance before, and wasn't the right audience for it. Crane's pale eyes ran through several calculations and went still. Digby was taken at his home with a traveling bag packed. The county court injunction was voided within 48 hours by the federal court in Santa Fe. Esperanza Reyes and 2 other ranchers whose properties had been taken under pressure gave statements to Colton's office. The newspaper editor in Santa Fe ran a piece in the territorial paper that made Crane's name recognizable in Albuquerque and beyond. The county judge who'd issued the injunction resigned. The county sheriff, facing the federal inquiry and apparently lacking the nerve for it, requested a transfer that was denied, and he resigned in turn. Then it came to Decker's situation. Colton sat down with him at the kitchen table once the depositions were complete. The warrant existed, but was the product of a complaint filed by people now under federal indictment. 2 federal judges he trusted had looked at the matter. The consensus was that pursuing it would require the government to simultaneously prosecute the man who had supplied the evidence making the Crane case possible, which was the kind of self-contradiction federal courts avoided when they could. The charge would likely be reduced to a technical violation. No further consequence beyond the record. You'd have to testify, Colton said. I know. And come back to Santa Fe. I know that too. Colton studied him for a moment. We could use you, Caleb. 3 cases right now that are exactly what you do, and not enough people who can work them the way you do. Decker was quiet. He looked at the table, at the lamp, at the window where the afternoon light lay long and warm over the valley outside. I'll think about it, he said. Colton accepted this without pressing. He understood that some decisions have to arrive on their own. 2 days later, Colton and his deputies rode north. The dust from their horses settled. The Vasquez ranch was quiet again. Cattle on the east flat, the spring running clear in its stone basin, the August morning bright and ordinary. Nora was on the porch steps. Decker stood in the yard with the buckskin saddled. The quality of the silence between them had weight in it, the accumulated weight of 3 weeks of mornings and evenings, and the particular thing that happens between people who have defended something together and know what it cost and what it was worth. Santa Fe, she said. That's where Colton is. You'd be a marshal again. She wasn't arguing, just establishing what the choice meant. Something like it. He looked at the valley, at the east flat, at the spring. There are people I can help through that work that I can't help any other way. She nodded once, slowly. Then she said what she decided to say. You could stay. The spring generates lease income now that nobody can threaten anymore. The operation could grow with real attention. There's more than enough work here for 2 people. She looked at him with the same directness she'd used from the beginning. I'm not asking because I need someone to manage what's mine. I can manage what's mine, as you've had 3 weeks to observe. I'm asking because this place would be better with you in it than without you. He looked at her. This was one of those moments where a man has a clear understanding of what he's choosing between, and the understanding is uncomfortable because both things are real and both matter. I need to go to Santa Fe, he said. Finish the testimony. Get the warrant resolved. Talk to Colton properly about what comes after. A pause. After that, I'd like to come back. If the offer holds. The corner of her mouth moved. I expect it will, she said. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up. She came down off the porch steps to stand in the yard, and he looked at her from the saddle. Your husband's ledger, he said. Keep the original in the root cellar where fire can't reach it. And if anyone else comes asking about the spring before I'm back, The federal brand protection applies to the water rights, as well as the land boundary. I know you know. He touched the brim of his hat. I'm saying it because I need to say something. A real smile then, brief and clear, surprised out of her. He turned the buckskin north and rode. The cottonwoods at the curve of the road took him from her sight before he was a mile out, and she stood in the yard and watched the dust settle, and then she turned back to the spring and the ordinary business of the day. And the morning was bright and dry, and the water ran cold over the limestone edge, patient and certain, indifferent to everything men had done around it. He came back 43 days later. He rode in on an October afternoon when the light was long and golden over the east flat, and the cottonwoods had gone yellow at the tips, and the air carried the first edge of something cold to come. The warrant was withdrawn, the federal appointment reinstated, modified to let him work cases in the Southern Territory out of the Santa Fe office. He had Colton's letter in his saddlebag and a commission paper, and the quiet of a man who's finished something that needed finishing and knows where he's going next. Nora was at the spring when she heard the hooves. She looked up, saw the buckskin, saw the man on it, and went back to checking the catch tank. When he rode into the yard, she was still at the spring with her back to him. The spring's still here, she said. I can see that. He stepped down from the saddle. The buckskin immediately put its nose toward the water trough. 43 days. I know. She finished with the catch tank, dried her hands on her work apron, and turned. Something in her expression was the same as it had always been, direct and clear. And something was different, too. Easier. The way a person looks when they've stopped holding a thing at arm's length. Your room in the barn, she said. I was hoping we might discuss different arrangements. She looked at him for a moment. Then, come inside. Coffee's on. He followed her in. The cottonwoods bent a little in the October wind. The spring ran over its stone lip, cold and clear, the same as it had run for 100 years before either of them arrived, and the same as it would run long after both of them were gone. Nora Vasquez held that ranch for 41 more years. She registered the spring under federal water rights protection in 1887 when the territorial framework was formalized, one of the first such designations in the county. The lease income, reliable as the spring itself, funded improvements Alejandro had sketched in the margins of his ledger, and never had the capital to build. A proper stone barn, a bunkhouse for hired help. In 1889, she paid half the cost of a schoolhouse in Tierra Blanca and convinced 3 neighboring ranches to fund the rest. An infirmary followed in 1892, small but clean and well supplied, and it stayed open for the next 60 years. Holloway Crane stood trial in Santa Fe in the spring of 1882. 4 counts of federal land fraud, 2 of corrupting a public official. His lawyers were expensive and skilled, and reduced the sentence from what the prosecution had sought. But they couldn't undo 3 years of Alejandro Vasquez's careful handwriting, the fraudulent survey documents, and the testimony of Esperanza Reyes. 7 years served. He died in an Albuquerque boarding house in 1891, which is where men like Crane tend to end up when the arrangements they've built finally come apart. Digby cooperated with the prosecution and received a reduced consequence. He left New Mexico Territory and was not heard from in those parts again. Caleb Decker worked cases for the Santa Fe Marshal's office for the next 12 years. The kind of work that doesn't always make the territorial papers, but that leaves a specific mark on a specific kind of man. He was at the Rancho de la Fuente most evenings, when the work allowed it, which it did with increasing frequency as Colton assigned him cases in the Southern Territory. On the first day of spring in 1883, in the small church in Tierra Blanca, he and Nora Vasquez were married by a preacher who found the ceremony the most straightforward work he'd done in some time. They set 2 cups on the spring basin every August on the morning of the anniversary of the day Crane rode out and said what he said. 1 cup they drank together. The other, they let the cold water carry slowly over the stone lip and back into the earth. Now, partner, here we are at the end of it. I've been carrying this story since that August morning in the Tierra Blanca Valley. Long enough to have worked out what I think it means, which is the best any of us can do with the things we've witnessed. What stays with me isn't the gun work. What stays with me is the ledger. Alejandro Vasquez's ledger, 3 years of careful entries under the stone floor of a root cellar, written by a man who could see clearly what was coming and understood he couldn't stop it alone, but believed the truth, written down and preserved, had more staying power than the men working to erase it. He was right. He didn't live to know he was right. The record he kept outlasted the man who was trying to bury it, and that's the whole story in one sentence. There's something in that worth sitting with. Most of the time in this world, the men with money and connections and the right officials in their pocket can make their arrangements hold long enough to matter. They rely on the impression that the outcome is already decided. They send a lawyer first, then a survey company, and they dress the taking up as procedure, until the person being taken from can't find the seam where it started. The man who breaks that spell doesn't always have a badge or a famous name. Sometimes he's a wanted man on a tired horse who needed water. The thing he brings isn't just speed on the draw, though. That doesn't hurt. It's the willingness to say out loud, in the open yard, in front of everyone, that the arrangement is a lie, and to stand in that yard long enough for the people invested in the lie to decide what to do about it. And the woman who keeps the ledger, who modifies the fuse by 2 inches because she's thought through the problem more carefully than the man who built it, who holds her own spring with her chin up and her hands open and doesn't flinch. She is the reason it works. She's the reason there's something to find when the right person comes looking. She's the reason the story ends the way it does. Keep the ledger, partner. Write it down. Tell the truth to the people who can act on it. And when a man tells you to sell what's yours or suffer the consequences, remember that inevitability is just a story he's been telling himself. Stories can be interrupted. Thank you for riding along tonight, my friend. If this story meant something to you, go ahead and give it a like, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new one. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now, what time it is, whether you've got something warm to drink. We read every one of those, and they mean more than you'd think. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry and your conscience clean. This is a work of fiction, inspired by the spirit and history of the American frontier. All characters, events, and locations are fictional. AI tools were used in the production of this content.